Well, good morning. My name is Brian Swanson, and I'm one of the pastors here. And I have an admission to offer to you. I have become one of those grumpy, crotchety people. You know what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not talking about one of those people that runs out of their house, "Get off my lawn!" Not like that. But I am, and I fully embrace that I am someone who can't stand it when someone does not come to a full stop, especially near my street. Here's why. I live on a cul-de-sac, and there are a total of 14 kids, and 10 of those kids are under the age of 15. It's a fun place to be. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting a tricycle. They're just crawling all over each other, the kids, not dead cats. And it's a blast, but we live in a cul-de-sac, and so there's a four-way stop, and when people, so many times, I can't tell you how many people will just blow through that stop sign intersection like they've got a green light for days. I get enraged. It's not that hard to come to a stop. It's not like our cul-de-sac butts up to the Kansas Speedway. Right? If Bubba Wallace were driving down and this was a Kansas Speedway, I wouldn't expect him to stop. No, but I'd be happy to settle for a slow rolling stop, even, because at least there would be a little bit of a pause, right? You could see that they're pausing. It'd be enough time to see, if there's any danger, that sort of thing. I want a full stop. Now that I have told you that, I need to tell you this. I have fully secured my reputation so that if I myself, whether I'm coming back home or leaving to go out of the neighborhood, if I don't come to a full stop, if there's just a slight amount of movement on my tires, my neighbors will not let me hear the end of it. And that's okay. That's okay with me. We are starting a new series. It's week 1 of Love Your Neighbor. We're looking at a concept that is central to Christianity: love. Love is supposed to be that defining factor in our lives. It's not supposed to be our hobbies. It's not our job or career. It's love. How we express love in our lives. That is what is supposed to be defining for how people think of us and how people think of us when we're not around them in that particular moment. How do we express our love for them? In fact, it's such a big concept that in one of his letters to a community of people, John writes this: "Let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." God is love. This passage of the Bible is written by one of Jesus' closest friends and one of his disciples that he spent the most amount of time with when he was in his earthly ministry 2,000 years ago. And you might not know what John's nickname was before this idea transformed his life, that God is love and that love is a higher good and greater purpose than anything else. His nickname with his brother James, they were known as the Sons of Thunder. The Sons of Thunder. And they got this nickname from moments like this when Jesus and his crew had been rejected by a village that was opposed to Jesus and his crew. And they said, "Get out of here. We don't want your message anymore." So they left. And this is what the Sons of Thunder's response was. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" And Jesus' reaction was pretty much like this: No, I don't want you to call fire from heaven to destroy them. No, what do you think I'm doing around? Do you think Jesus ever muttered under his breath to himself and was like, "Boneheads, I'm working with a bunch of boneheads"? Because I think he muttered stuff like that, in love, of course, obviously. But hey, everyone, there's hope for us. There's hope for me. If the Sons of Thunder, which, by the way, that sounds like a tag team for a professional wrestling circuit, right? Like the WWE, the Sons of Thunder, they get announced, they come out and they're like doing all this routine, and before they jump in the ring and they body slam people, and the Sons of Thunder. If the Sons of Thunder can grasp this idea that God is love and that their world can be changed and stop this desire to call fire down to burn a village. There's hope for our world, is there not? There's hope that this love can do things that we have seen it do and change how this world thinks of love. However we think of God, good, righteous, everywhere all at once, omnipotent, John, the son of thunder, says it simply, that God is love. God is love. And if we're created in the image of God, then that means to be human is to love. If we're created in the image of God and God is love, then it means for our neighbors that to be truly human is to love our neighbor. It's what's supposed to define us, just like the son of thunder very clearly says that God is love. That's the message that's supposed to define our world. And since we're the ones who are mostly in charge of this world, we shape the earth to make it the way we want it. We tame wild animals. We grow crops. We are the stewards of creation. But love doesn't define our world, does it? Instead, our world gets characterized by war and misinformation from every side, from hoarding resources and ignoring the poor to turning our backs on the oppressed. It's why every day thousands of children die from starvation and preventable diseases, because love doesn't define our world the way it should. There's something in us. There's something in the world that's broken. And it's this thing called sin. And sin is this big word, only 3 letters, but what it means is that we're missing the mark for which God has called us to hit. We're missing the mark of the way we're supposed to live our lives. And because of our sinful nature, because of the general self-absorbed lives that we live when we're not focused on following Jesus and putting his practices, his teachings into practice, love is not what our world is focused on. Now, this word love in 1 John chapter 4, it's this Greek word agape. Now, in Greek, there are a handful of words that are used to try and describe all the different facets of love and what love is like. There's one word that describes intimate romantic love. There's one word that describes brotherly love, friendship kind of love. And then there's agape. Agape love is the kind of love that's moral. It's a moral love. And it goes beyond the other two types of love. There's a determination to agape. It defies everything else in the world. Agape love defeats opposition and fear and ridicule. And agape is what we are supposed to be defined by. A few verses later, John asks the question, if we claim to love God but don't love our brother or sister or our neighbor, do we really love God? It's a good question for all of us to reflect on. And that's why we're doing this series, Love Your Neighbor. Back in 2020, do you remember little parts of 2020? Back in 2020, the Church of the Resurrection, they did a sermon series called Love Your Neighbor, and they had this big, huge campaign, and they invited churches to join them. And since it's election season again, the midterms, the first major elections to come after an extremely ugly and divisive presidential election. Do you remember any of that at all? Does this sound familiar? Will these midterms be just as ugly? I mean, they're already kind of starting to ramp up in the ugliness. But just because these elections are going to be ugly, it doesn't mean that we need to be ugly. Do you believe that? Do you believe that we can refrain from being ugly with people we don't agree with? Do you believe that Jesus says, love your neighbor, and that we should strive to do that? A lot of people have been turned off in the past handful of years because Christians are coming across as thinking that they know all of the answers. And there have been some ugly moments in the past few years, and even maybe in the past couple of decades that kind of point to that. And it's caused people to lift those up and point to them and say, nope, that's missing the mark. I don't want to have anything to do with that. I don't want to call myself a Christian if that's what it means, if it means to be ugly to other people. Now, part of this is the nature of our faith, right? We believe in one God, and this one God is fully expressed in divine and human form in Jesus of Nazareth. And we've been tasked with this mission by Jesus himself to go out into all of the world and to tell everyone, no matter where you are, whether it's in class, it's in your neighborhood, whether it's across the globe, no matter where you are going, to tell people about this love of God expressed in Jesus, the death and resurrection. It's our mission. And so we hope that this entire world falls in love with this one God. So sometimes we get so focused on being right that we lose focus on how we are supposed to love our neighbor. And if we lose sight of that relationship, if we get so worked up over trying to prove the other person wrong and that we are right, we lose sight of what it means to love our neighbor. And of all of the things to lose sight of, loving your neighbor is not supposed to be one of those. Way back when, the prophets, they took their job seriously as pointing out the things that weren't right in the world. And they took other nations to task quite a bit. And sometimes they turned their eyes on to the people of Israel and their leaders. And they talked about the leaders of Israel failing their people from time to time. And Ezekiel, he was one of these prophets, and he brought some of this stuff up. And he writes this after thousands of Jews were taken out of their homeland and enslaved and exiled, after their country is just desecrated by the Babylonian Empire. And this is what he says. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel, and prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, presumably the whey. You clothe yourselves with the wool and the slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. They were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Now, Ezekiel isn't talking about literal shepherds looking for literal sheep. He's talking about leaders not taking care of their people. And all of these things that Ezekiel is complaining about, all of these are expressions of love. Strengthening people who need help, taking care of the sick, going after those who are wandering and lost. And this should give us some pause. We should each reflect about our own faith and think to ourselves, what's my faith about? Is my faith all about me? Is my faith always revolving around my problems? Or does my faith and love for God spill out beyond my scope and helps me see other people and their needs? Does our relationship with Jesus prompt us to serve other people? Our faith is supposed to lead to loving other people, and love without action is dead. It says this in James. In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Now, I'm not James, the brother of Jesus, who wrote this in a letter to a church congregation way back when, but I think that you could still insert the word love for faith, and this is how it would read. In the same way, love by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Now, passages like Ezekiel's, they serve to inform Jesus and his vocation, his purpose, and his mode of operation. Jesus took the mantle of being a shepherd seriously. This is what he said about himself. He said, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." And this is how Matthew, one of those disciples, described Jesus and how he performed his ministry, how he went about ministering to people. It says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." So here are the three things that characterized Jesus' ministry. One, he was a herald. He went out everywhere and he said, "Hey, the kingdom of God is here. God is bursting into the world here through me. It's started, it's begun, and it's only going to grow like a mustard seed that grows everywhere, wild." Jesus was a healer. He was a healer. He went everywhere and healed people of their diseases. He took care of them. He had compassion on them. And this is said by this guy named William Barclay, pardon me, who was a theologian and a Bible scholar back in the 1900s. Doesn't that sound so far away ago? So long ago? 1900s, but I mean, it was a long time ago when this guy was alive. He said, Jesus turned the words of Christian truth into the deeds of Christian love. So Jesus was a herald, he was a healer, and he was a teacher. And all of his teachings revolved around what it means to love God and to love our neighbor. Jesus took the mantle of being that shepherd seriously, and he invites us to take that purpose on in our lives too. Full stop. Love your neighbor. Full stop. I saw this book a couple months ago, and the title and the subtitle intrigued me. It's called Honestly, Getting Real About Jesus and Our Messy Lives. It's really good. Shout out to the Contemporary Believers Study Group. They went through this book recently. And the author in this book said this about love. Love is the centerpiece of Jesus' message. Love was how he thought and operated. He rocked his disciples' world by telling them to love even their enemies. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Brian, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to love my neighbor. Some of the things I've done have kind of fallen short, or I just don't. Do they need another pan of brownies? Well, I get that. But sometimes it's instinctual. Kind of like running after a kid before the car that's caroming, just going real fast down your street can get to the kid. Maybe it's knowing that they're sick and that they need their yard mowed. I've got a neighbor who is incredible at an instinctual thing. She's got the spiritual gift. A spiritual gift is a way that God has uniquely designed you to help other people, to serve other people. And I'm convinced that my friend Pam has a spiritual gift of organizing meal trains. That's in Scripture somewhere, right? But that's her gift. She hears that someone's sick and she rings that bell. It's on the internet. She's like, hey, we need to feed these people. Let's do it. Sometimes it's out of your gifts. Sometimes you love your neighbor out of your gifts. A couple of weeks ago, our oldest had gotten herself into some trouble with her mother and I, and we were verbally guiding her through it. And our kindergartner, Poppy, she wanders off, and I didn't think a thing of it because we're in the kitchen, and Poppy happened to be in there when we're having this big conversation, and she goes off, and she wasn't in trouble, and so it was fine for her to leave. And a few minutes later, she comes back, and we're near the end of helping our oldest understand our perspective. And Poppy just goes right up to her and hands her this. Isn't that so sweet? She saw her sister. Maybe they had this deal where Livy kind of gave her a wink, like, hey, I'm in trouble, because it stopped me in my tracks. And I don't remember the rest of the conversation, but this little girl who has this heart full of love, she wanted to express that love to her sister. A week or so later, her middle sister was pulling something out of the freezer and dropped whatever she was trying to get out of the freezer right on her big toe, and there were screams upon screams upon screams. You all heard it in your homes. And I'm trying to console her, trying to make her feel better, and I'm like, you want an ice pack? And she's like, no, and I'm like, that makes sense. You just dropped something really cold on your foot. You don't want to. It's going to remind you of it, I guess. And so Poppy comes in again, and she had given Rosie this. Come on, kid. Like, this love that she has, she's just expressing it out of her gifts. She's not the first kid that when she discovers that you've recycled some of her drawings gets upset. Why aren't you keeping this and putting it in the Louvre? Right? She's just like every other kid that way. But she just will draw. It's the way that she expresses, hey, I love you. Seeing someone in pain or needing, picking up and making a move just to do that, that's what it means to love your neighbor. Now, this is an aside. This isn't really about loving your neighbor, but I looked at that as an example of Jesus telling us to have faith like a little child, of just responding out of love. That's what we're supposed to do. That's what little kids do all of the time. They look after each other. They make sure that they're okay. So sometimes loving your neighbor is instinctual. Sometimes it's out of your gifts. And sometimes you've got to figure it out. You've got to sit down and do the brain work. You've got to pray, discern, think through the situation. And I get that you might have tricky relationships with your neighbors. I get that. Not every relationship is perfect. It might take some reflection and conversation to figure out how to love your neighbor. Well, loving someone means trying to understand their perspective on things. That's part of it. And so maybe we need to ask ourselves this question: what's the most loving thing I can do in this situation? Most of the time, if you think through that, you pray about it, and you answer yourself honestly, whatever that is probably going to be the right thing to do. Now, we try to get out of work all of the time. We try to kind of slink away from our responsibilities. And this was the case for people 2,000 years ago. And so there were some people that were trying to test Jesus. And they essentially asked him, out of this whole Bible thing, they didn't phrase it that way, this whole Bible thing, what's the most important thing that I need to do, that I need to have a handle on? And Jesus replies, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Now, the Jews back then, they would have got that. They'd have been like, yeah, obviously, totally. We could have told you that, for sure. Jesus keeps going. He says this, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. All of it. And that whole set of scriptures, all of it hangs on those two commandments. Love God with everything and love your neighbor as yourself. Love for your neighbor is just as central to our faith as loving God. Our job is to love our neighbor. Leave the house every day? Love your neighbor. Stuck in traffic? Love your neighbor. See a Facebook post that you don't like or agree with? Love your neighbor. Full stop. That's what we're called to do. I want to end with this story. My wife is an elementary school counselor in the Blue Springs district, and this past week, a gentleman in who lives in the attendance area of her school, who doesn't have kids, gives money every single week to bless his neighbors. And this past week, he came in and he gave her 6 alarm clocks and 3 Quick Trip gift cards to purchase Freezonies to help kids improve their attendance. How great is that? It's creative, it's unique, it's meeting a need. This man is loving his neighbors. Love your neighbor. Full stop. Please pray with me.